that means.
You should have nice.
Okay, we're live, whatever that means.
You got a nice review today.
You do, we got several of them.
Front page is fab. You really.
Yeah. And then the big picture on the other one. Well, it depends on.
It's a really, really.
They seem to have fun.
Hello. How are you?
Good evening, friends. My name is Tim. I'm artistic director of In Series. We're so happy to have you here tonight. I was telling the panelists that we had about 60 people signed up, but when it's a free event, you never know how many people are going to show up. I was hoping the lure of food and drink afterwards might help. Hopefully some more friends will come in as we're going along. As many of you know, the director salons for the In Series have historically been a place where the creative team and the artists perform an excerpt of the piece and talk about that. We changed the format last year to be groups of scholars, thinkers on the themes of a particular project from diverse and divergent fields coming together just to have a conversation about those themes and to find commonality and interconnections between the different fields that we work in, and hopefully to have a deeper connection therefore with opera. This season, while that format was really successful and we loved it, we felt some productions need something a bit different. Butterfly is, as many of you have heard me talk about, is of course the quintessence of a canonical work. It's at the center of, it's the beating heart, along with a handful of other operas, of what makes opera distinct as an art form. I personally think, maybe my colleagues will disagree with me, I personally think something that is inherent in opera, and I hope will not be lost, is that we work over a great arc of history that we're the opposite of film, where an actor and an audience will encounter a text once and not see that again unless you're Harrison Ford doing Han Solo and have 4 or 5 hours with it. But in general, you have one encounter with the text. In opera, we have the privilege as audiences and as artists to work over a lifetime with characters, with musical themes, with dramatic themes, and that's something wonderful. And that means we search for pieces of genius because they have to have something of the eternal in them to be able to give over a lifetime. And that means our canon is fluid in a very slow pace. Pieces move into it and out of it over a greater period of time. But that also means that in addition to the eternal, those pieces have elements of the specific times in which they were written, which are painful and difficult and need to be talked about. And of course, that has to do with issues of gender, issues of race, issues of cultural appropriation. And so in making Butterfly, which I hope some of you have seen or will get to see in a production that sort of tries to take race out of it, we also thought it was important to have a conversation about what it means that we perform these pieces over and over again in a sort of ritual, and that they contain very painful historical context about race. And before we start, I also want to add to that I'm very aware, and in preparing for it, I've been very aware that I'm white and male and gay, and in the opera world that makes me particularly privileged. And I'm very aware of the fact that Will surprise no one. Any of that. I'm also aware, of course, that that as an audience, we are very white, and so the conversation we're going to have tonight is inherently incomplete and lacks an abundance of important voices, and is going to be insufficient, and it's a starting place, and it's been a real struggle to try and craft. I'm going to talk about this a bit later, to craft what the nature and the direction of the conversation will be, just because of the knowledge that it is inherently insufficient. But we're going to do it anyway. And with that, I want to introduce our guests. And I look forward to giving them a rousing welcome. But if we could just hold that until I've done all of the impressive bios. To my left is soprano Brittani McNeill. Expressive interpretation and a flexible range allows soprano Brittani McNeill to explore a wide span of music across genres and voice types. Currently an artist with Washington National Opera, Brittani performs as a soloist and in ensembles nationwide. She recently made her arena stage debut in the world premiere of Tazewell Thompson's Jubilee. Brittani is a graduate of Peabody Conservatory. We have 3 Peabody Conservatory grads. Go Peabody. Go Peabody. Blue Jays. Go Blue Jays. Brittani is a graduate of Peabody Conservatory, where she was a proud recipient of the G. Raymond Seafield Endowed Scholarship. She also earned a master's degree in vocal performance at Morgan State University and a Bachelor of Music and Performance at East Carolina University. A semi-finalist in the 2014 Sylvia Green Voice Competition, Brittani appeared as Julia in the U.S. premiere of Jonathan Dove's Mansfield Park at the Baltimore Theater Project, celebrating the 200th anniversary of Jane Austen's novel. Past operatic performances include Cendrillon, The Medium, All of the Night Visitors, Dream Lovers by Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and The Consul. A highlight on the concert stage was an appearance with the Peabody Concert Orchestra as a soloist in Bach's Magnificat. In addition to her classical training, Brittani has performance, recording, and teaching experience in various genres and traveled for 2 years as the lead singer of a hip-hop soul band. Demonstrating and encouraging a strong commitment to community engagement and activism is an important part of Brittani's work. She works and volunteers in the Baltimore community, a highlight of that service being conceptualization and coordination of a community festival of West Baltimore in 2015. Serves on committees dedicated to improving local institutions through diversity and cultural competency, and uses music to foster conversations about social and racial justice. She's the founder of the Peabody Society of Black Alumni, SOBA, and a member of the Peabody Diversity Pathway Task Force. Brittani is also an avid writer and holds a BS in communication with a concentration on broadcast journalism. To her left is Dr. Lester Green, the artistic director for the Coalition for African Americans in the Performing Arts, a nonprofit arts organization, and works with an executive team and community partners to regularly showcase, acknowledge, encourage, and develop excellence in the achievements of classical musicians of color in the USA and abroad. For 10 years, he served as Minister of Music at Historic Metropolitan AME Church in Washington, D.C., where he led music for worship services honoring such luminaries as President Barack and Michelle Obama, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Oprah Winfrey, Cicely Tyson, the late Rosa Parks, and others. A South Carolina native and Phi Mu Alpha Symphonian, Dr. Lester Green has extensive experience as a solo pianist, recital partner, and conductor. He has served on the teaching and coaching faculties of Johns Hopkins, Peabody Institute, Morgan State University, and Duke Ellington School of the Arts. Green formerly served as an assistant conductor, vocal coach, and clinician for the Washington National Opera. Dr. Green earned degrees in solo piano performance from the University of South Carolina, Johns Hopkins University, Peabody Institute, and the University of Maryland, where he earned the Doctor of Musical Arts degree in collaborative piano. He's a pianist and conductor who has collaborated with world-class opera singers spanning many generations. His film credits include Samuel Coleridge Taylor and his music in America 1900 to 1912 and Beyond the Mask, a PBS documentary. And on the end is Colin Brush, artistic administrator at Washington National Opera, working with Francesca Zambella and the WNO artistic team in casting the WNO productions and artistic administration of the company. He's a frequent lecturer on opera at the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts and works intimately with WNO's social impact programming. Prior to joining Washington National Opera, he was an aptitude consultant with the Johnson O'Connor Research Foundation and the company manager at the Maryland Opera Studio. He holds a bachelor's in fine arts from Carnegie Mellon University and a master's of music from the University of Maryland. Please join me in welcoming them. Thank you all for agreeing to go with us on this journey tonight. I always begin these panels by asking why X. So when we have a panel of a poet and a philosopher and whatever, why philosophy, why poetry, right? We're all from the opera world, so the question's going to be the same. But I'm going to ask it in two different ways. Can we maybe start by just saying why each of you personally decided on a life that's dedicated to music and opera?
I think it found me, or I actually, as he stated, my first degree was in journalism, in broadcast journalism, and about halfway through that degree program, I found myself the only person who wasn't a music major, like sitting through master classes and things of that nature. And so I decided to audition. I mean, I sang my whole life, but I don't think I intended to pursue it professionally. Decided to audition for the School of Music. I thought I was going to be a musical theater major, and they were like, "Oh, you got to take, 3 or 4 semesters of classical voice." And I was like, "Okay, well, I mean, I've done choir." That was really it. And then I started, and that was it. Never got to those musical theater lessons. Never got to the theater department. Opera was it. Classical music was it for me, and it was just a natural thing. And I think it falls in line kind of with what I do as a writer. They're both sort of art forms. They're both art forms that some people might say are dying or something, or changing. The way that you see bloggers and the internet has really changed the way journalism works, and so many things have changed the way opera works, and so, or doesn't work, yeah, right. And so it was just that it found me in a way, and it just did.
Well, I am the child of 2 ministers, and we had music as part of church all the time. As a kid, I was a very good mimic, and so I was introduced to music through mimicking people and also through cartoons. And when shows like, to show my age, like Laverne and Shirley and Happy Days and Different Strokes and Good Times would come on television, I would run to piano wherever I was, either at home or at a cousin's house, and try to pick out the melodies and things on the piano. And luckily, very luckily, in South Carolina, Richland County School District 2, we had excellent music education programs in the public schools. And so I learned to play trombone about 6th grade, but before that, we had music teachers teaching us solfege, and we had choral programs. And by the time I was in 8th grade, I'd been playing trombone for about 3 years, and I actually learned to read most of my music in band. And I was like, I read the bass clef, and I read the treble clef, and I looked in a hymn book. I was like, that's what piano players read, right? See, I had been playing by ear, and I was like, let me try this out. And I was like, whoa, I can play that. And then I also learned that the musicians that were in the churches where I was growing up in, they weren't playing what was in the hymn books, but they had it open, I guess, for the words or whatever. But just like lots of encouragement from my music teachers. And I was one who lived in a creative world, like, by myself. Like, I would rather stay at the piano creating music than to go outside and play with friends. And so, in fact, I actually used to have to babysit my younger cousin who lived with us. And, really, I was practicing the piano and all the other kids going outside, and she saw me reading from the piano books, and she'd bring her storybook up. She said, play this one. And I was like, okay, I'm the only one in the house with her right now. Okay, so I didn't play her stories, and keep her entertained. But it so happened that I'd gotten a band director to write a recommendation for South Carolina Government School for the Arts. We thought I was going to audition on trombone, and then the choir director thought I was going to audition on, I guess, voice. And then so I auditioned on piano and got in. And that summer, changed my life. From the Eastern School of Music, Doctors Anthony and Mary Ann Minty, they were the piano teachers there, and they brought also with them for a master class for a week, Dr. Lilita True from Eastern School. And she sort of gave us the rundown of what we needed to do to become professional pianists. And so we took a big trip to the McNeill music store. We bought Bach, preludes and fugues and inventions and Beethoven sonatas, and that was what all he wanted us for that summer. And then we, luckily, they were sold in volumes that were pretty cheap at that time. And then, I began practicing, and being a person that didn't have a lot of social friends and outlets, I studied a lot. I was a straight A student, and I studied German in high school because nobody was doing it. Everybody was doing Spanish or French. And so I was like, well, everybody's doing Spanish, I want to do that. And I don't want to do French because French is too snobby. I was a high schooler, I knew everything. So, but nobody was doing German, so I took the German class, and it made sense. I became an exchange student. I auditioned for, with an academic scholarship, I auditioned at the University of South Carolina and got a full music ride. And from then on, I thought I was going to be, a concert pianist, and I would practice all the time, and I guess magically people would love me or something. But one day, Thomas Fauntleroy, who was from Washington, D.C., he was a black man that had come to the University of South Carolina, hired as their new opera professor, charged with revitalizing the opera program there. He pulled me aside and he said, "You play the piano?" I said, "Yeah." "And you speak German?" I said, "Yeah." And he was like, "Have you ever considered becoming a coach?" I was like, "What's a coach?" He said, "Well, you should really study conducting." And I was like, "Conducting? Beethoven, I don't understand." And he invited me to one of his opera workshop classes, and I saw him work with singers. And I was like, wow, you can do that? It's magic. And I auditioned for his summer internship program, went to Italy, and then my life changed ever since. So that's how I came to this.
I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which sort of has a very rich musical tradition. There's lots of very high level classical music experiences, some really interesting symphony halls and a big opera house. And I was in a choir that would often get hired to sing the children's chorus parts in different operas. The Mace Festival is a big choral tradition in Cincinnati that performs the symphony. And so I was in the opera as a child at Cincinnati Opera because of these choruses, and got exposure to, I guess, the grandeur of this world at a very young age. And I really loved it. It just kind of always felt at home. This was where I felt the most me. And as I grew up, my voice changed, and I thought maybe it'd be over. I'm also a trumpet player, piano player, and a steel drum player. And so I had all sorts of musical outlets, but I started taking some voice lessons just to see what my voice sounded like, because it had always been kind of my first love. And I had a voice teacher that encouraged me and said, if you wanted to do this, you probably could. And so I auditioned at a bunch of universities, got into a program I loved, kept developing, got into a grad program I loved, and towards the end of it, decided that I kind of loved the big picture. I mean, I love singing, but I have the most generic voice type, literally, in all of opera. And I would have a healthy diet of pretty much like Rossini and an occasional Donizetti. And while I love it, the things that have always captured my heart are like the Mahler and the Wagner and the Strauss and the really big things I would have no business singing. And I've always been one that likes arranging big projects and putting things together and kind of thinking at a macro level. So I was working at this psychological nonprofit that studied how people engaged their brain and their types of thinking to their work. And their testing and their research would suggest that doing what I'm doing now is probably a more suitable use for my actual set of types of, I guess, natural strengths in thinking. So I just kind of endeavored, tried to do something different, and I have now been at Washington National Opera for 7 years, and it's really been a very positive and great place for me to grow into the admin and planning side.
Now can we come back down the gallery with a slightly more difficult question, which is why opera now? in the world of why stay in opera, in a world of Me Too and Black Lives Matter and mass shootings and immigration disasters, like why, I'm sure we all wrestle with this question of like, why are we doing this?
For me, I'll take an example from today. So the Kennedy Center has just opened up a new building. It's called The Reach. For the next 2 weeks, we have a festival of all free, this is my little plug, I'm sorry, of all free programming. And I really suggest going because it's a fabulous new space. It's really meant to show you the artistic process and give you a link with the artists in a way that maybe you wouldn't in kind of the bigger behemoth spaces. So it's Monday, and we had 3 chamber concerts with singers at 12, 2, and 4 o'clock. And I thought to myself, I'm going to be really depressed because there's not going to be anyone there because it's a classical music concert and it's in the middle of the day. Like, who's going to show up and does anyone care? And we were at capacity today in a space that fit about like 300 people. So we had a ton, and so I say that because every time I think that we are really on the decline, something surprises me. And I think there's something to be said about, because there's so much beautiful music and so much grandeur and just so much sensory overload in a way, we can tackle issues in a way that other art forms cannot. And there's an impact that I think opera, when it's done right, it can really, really hit you in the heart. I also thought that I see so much opera, I thought I was immune to the emotional experiences. And I saw this production of Yennefer, and at the very end, she's talking about how she's never felt that she would be loved for who she was, and maybe I was just in a vulnerable place that day. But like as she's singing that, and as at the end of this dramatic story, I mean, I was weeping like at the end, which again I do not do, and it really affected me even after. And I looked around the audience, and I was in the majority. Everyone else was as well. So it was that kind of experience that reminded me that really we've got this kind of emotional key. And in a world where we are constantly distracted by our phones, 24/7, it's really nice to be focused and living in this kind of alternate universe and having a human and real experience for once, because they're now actually very rare.
Awesome. Well, why opera? Why now? Like, why still today? I have to say, for myself, I've very much always been on the outskirts of like, social acceptance. Like I was a nerd in school. Whenever I do something, I tend to do it to extremes. And so when I would study music, I would study it to the extreme. And so when I guess 1995, I auditioned for Peabody and I'd gotten in, and I did a master's degree there and a graduate performance diploma. And at all the time during that time, I mean, I was connected with the opera program there, but when at a place like Peabody, at least when I was a student there, like I didn't see a whole lot of people that looked like me. I could maybe count on one hand, like who looked like me. And so whenever there was an organization doing something for minority students, I would very often get called on, as a representative of my own race. And, and you can begin to feel like, when you don't see yourself reflected in the culture in which you want to work in, you can get discouraged. But when I finished a graduate performance diploma, I again gotten a call from Talmadge Fauntleroy. He wanted me to meet Maestro Willie Waters, who was the Connecticut Opera at that time, and he was connected with the Houston Ebony Opera Guild, and they had another apprenticeship, and Mr. Fauntleroy was like, Lester, you should audition. So I went to New York, auditioned, I got accepted, and so then I went to Houston for that summer. While I was there, and it was a short program, that one, it was, not more than a month long, that particular, it was a summer apprenticeship. I'd gotten a call almost every day from the late Nathan Carter, who was the head of the Fine Arts Department at Morgan State University. So you never know who's paying attention to you, especially when you're in a place where you think you're not represented, but like there are people who are watching you. And when you're reaching for excellence, you just never know who that is inspiring. So I bring that up, and it's sort of a long preamble, but I was 25 years old, and when I finished a master's degree at Peabody, I felt like, okay, I have skills, I played a few recitals, I'd been around amazing pianists, but see, I'd come from a school where there were 20 pianists, 4 of whom were performance majors, 16 of whom were pedagogy majors. 2 of the performance majors were undergrads, I was one of those, and the other 2 were doctoral students. And then I came to Peabody, where there were suddenly 400 pianists, and half of them were voice majors from Korea. And it was really, it's like, so, and everybody had perfect fingers, and it's like, oh my gosh, I felt like I'm so far behind, where do I fit in? How do I make this work? Well, finishing the master's degree, I was like, I'm not ready to confront the world, so I auditioned for the GPD. And then I grew more in that program, and I felt, okay, I can do something. But then when Nathan Carter, when we finally connected, I got the voicemail from my hotel phone room. Is that hotel voicemail? So, and we got on the phone, and we scheduled an interview for after the apprenticeship was over. I went to his office, auditioned, played a rehearsal or 2 for him, and within 2 days, I was greeting students as Mr. Greene. And understand, some of my students were older than I was, and I looked like a student, and it was like a trial by fire, I suddenly had 2 levels of music theory to teach, all levels of classic piano. I was vocal coaching, accompanying the choir, and I had some applied piano students. And I was like, Dr. Carter, are there any syllabuses that I could use? And he was like, green is your class, and I was like, okay, so it's either sink or swim. But it was the first place I'd been around more than 5 of me at the same time where people were really excelling. And it was one of the first time I was not like ridiculed for being excellent or for reaching towards excellence, and I was actually being celebrated. And there was so much talent at that school. It was incredible. And Nathan Carter could do with the choir. Like I'd heard gospel choirs before. I had heard classical choirs before. And many times the gospel choirs looked like me, and the classical choirs were not like me. And they had different levels of expertise, but Nathan Carter was one of the first time I heard a choir do such a broad range of repertoire, and he could make a choir sound like a soloist in its phrasing, and it was like, wow, this can be done. It's okay. You don't have to ask for permission to excel in this way. And so it was organizations like Morgan State University that gave me opportunities. And and I'd gone to Aspen Music Festival. I'd seen lots of people who didn't look like me. But when I come back and I got that, I guess, affirmation from others who were trying to really excel, like to the tops of their fields, but who also had similar backgrounds of maybe not always doing classical music, maybe like, they've done gospel, R&B, jazz, and they were so multi-talented, but they were hungry for opportunities. And so I found myself having a unique experience of, I'd grown up sheltered, I'd been in sort of schools that where I wasn't represented a whole lot, but I had the work ethic of the students who I was in school with, and now I was there looking at African American and other Black students who were hungry and who had the goods, and composers. I had not met other Black composers there, and so we had people on the faculty like Chinyere Ohia, who was from Nigeria, and then Nkiru Okoye, also Nigerian, who's written an opera for like Harriet Tubman, and her works are, being performed more and more. And I look now like at people who were in the classes students that I coach. Like there's a tenor, Izakai Savage, was one of my students in my piano class. I used to coach him, and I'm like, wow, he's singing around the world, like, and there's been so much talent and support. So it's very often been my job to fill in the holes in my community as an educator. And because when people would hear the talent and see the beautiful people, but hear the talent and hear the voices, they were like, I want that. And so it becomes a responsibility to one, you're supplying what's needed and wanted from people who are hungry and reaching for the arts. And also more of our own people are telling our stories in the arts and in opera. For example, for Kappa, we just last year, we had an opera composers showcase, and we had 3 composers come, Stephen Allen, Scott Patterson, and Joshua Banbury and Jasmine Barnes. They did a piece, 3 new operas telling stories about Black experience that no one knew about. And the creativity came from so many different places. And we've heard so often, the European stories, and we've heard the stories of the exotic, the Asian, the Oriental, told from European perspectives. But we haven't heard so much our own stories from ourselves. And so now, and I think also with, President Barack Obama and the First Lady, like with things changing this country as they did, Black people are popular, and people want to tell our stories, and they want to know what it is that we think about ourselves. And there's no reason not to tell our stories, because if we don't, then our stories die. And we have a particular way of delivering a communication, whether it's preaching or singing or whatever, it impinges and it reaches people and it produces a reaction, and it can change how people connect to us. So that's why we should do it.
I got a phone.
Yeah.
You said, why now, right? And I would say, why not? I think in opera, we build on this tradition of using this art form to, what we say in our community is to speak truth to power. And that's kind of what has always been done in a sense in opera, using opera to make fun of, the high class society or whatever the case may be. The problem in opera is not that, the problem with a lot of institutions is that when they don't, is when they don't grow, when they don't expand, when they don't move forward. Not necessarily that the institutions themselves are inherently bad or don't have value, but that they get stuck. And so we have all of these works in this field by old dead white guys that maybe spoke to the issues of their day. And we are stuck on them. We feel like we have to keep doing these shows because we love them. They have pretty music and these are the masters. And we forget that they were speaking to the issues of their day. And their views may have been progressive for their day, just like in Butterfly, right? For their day, their views have been progressive, their approach may have been progressive, the techniques that they used may have been progressive, but they're not progressive for us now. So why do we have so many challenges with these works now? Well, because 100 years later, 200 years later, things that, were progressive then are, so far behind us. So what do we do with this art form? We do the same thing. It just has to look different. We use our art to speak to the issues of our day. We use our art, and so sometimes that may mean that we have to discard some things. That may mean that we have to reimagine some things, and we have to be willing to do that, and not to be so stuck on the works and so stuck on what we know of the genre that we're willing to let the entire thing die, you know? And so that's why I say, like, why not? It's absolutely still, I actually heard an educator, talking to an educator, and they were saying, a lot of music educators in elementary and middle schools now say that some of the kids have trouble singing in head voice. They can't do it. They don't know how to do it because it's a sound that a lot of them are not hearing. You don't really hear it as much in popular music. Some people don't hear it in church. Some people aren't going to church, or if they are, they're not hearing that kind of, you know, sound. And other sounds aren't bad, you know, as he said in my bio, like I've done all genres, but it's a really interesting thing to think about children who might hear us sing opera and think it's weird or funny because they just have never heard those sounds before. But when you have programs that really do introduce kids to these words and these sounds, and you make them relevant for them, and you can do the same thing with preteens and teens and even adults. And when they are introduced to those things and they are relevant and they speak to things that they understand, then all of a sudden you have a whole different outlook. So I don't think the issue is necessarily that opera in and of itself as an art form is outdated. It's a matter of what we're willing to do with it and what we're willing to let go to get something new, maybe something better. And I think that's why we struggle. That's why the art form is struggling. And it has to be more than, I mean, gimmicks are cool. We do all sort of things to get people in the door, but it has to be more than that. You know, we can serve them beer, or we can wear jeans, or we can do whatever we do, but the art form itself still has to be appealing. And so we're seeing those things like it, you know, they're doing Blue this year about, you know, police brutality, and we're seeing things all over the place. We've seen the Central Park 5 opera that I think was happening down in Florida with Anthony Davis, and there's just so many different things that are happening. We're seeing so many women who are coming out and speaking to issues. And so I think that the tradition of this art form is actually far more progressive than what we want to recognize. And if we can show the world that, then we're looking at a totally different thing. People think it's old and it's, you know, it's stale because that's all we show them. But the traditions of even those old white dead guys was to use that music to speak to the issues of their day and to do things that were new and exciting and different. And so that's what we have to figure out.
I have to follow that.
Yeah.
I obviously I struggled a lot with how to shape the conversation today, as my messy notes give testament to. And I came to two conclusions. One is that I kind of want to keep the conversation simple and just have two lines of discussion. The first being to talk about the canon. I have sort of a list of works, but it can go anywhere it wants to go. And then about halfway through to turn to the industry today, so that we can get a perspective of like how a historical canon influences the way we function or don't function as an industry. And the other thing is that it's going to be a messy discussion, and I think let's just let it be messy and feel free to, you know, as if we're in the parlor having a conversation, to break in over top of each other and to just have a real conversation instead of standing on ceremony. But I thought it's only fair to start with Butterfly. But I also, one of the reasons I wanted Colin to come is because Othello is, of course, another piece that's difficult. And knowing that you guys are opening with that and we're opening with Butterfly, I thought it'd be a perfect time to talk about that. So I'm hoping that we'll go to Othello as well. If we could maybe just share openly thoughts about Butterfly, our own experiences with the piece. I, for one, loved Butterfly when I was 14, and as with a lot of works, there came a moment where you think, oh, wait a second, I like to call it the, oh, baby, it's cold outside moment. Wait a second, this isn't quite right. And Butterfly, of course, is at the center of a long history of orientalism in opera, and colonialism, And I wondered if we could talk a bit about that. Other works in that category, of course, Lakme and Pearl Fishers and Torndale and a lot of things. I had experience of seeing a local company do Pearl Fishers last year, and they did excellent. It was beautifully sung for the resources they had. It was really great. But seeing a bunch of white people dressed as Hindu Sri Lankans is difficult. And for me, I had this moment of thinking, oh, maybe that's because there's also this geopolitical context, and we know what France's history was in Southeast Asia, and somehow that was particularly difficult for me. So I don't know what our experiences are with Butterfly, but maybe if anyone has any thoughts about the piece, the way we cast it, the fact that there is this question of, is it better to use Asian soprano? What's Asian enough? What is that? Where does that lead us? So any thoughts?
Can we go ahead?
Well, for me, so anytime I think about Butterfly, being Black, I always think about Porgy. I can't, it always comes back to that for me. And so my first thought, when I was asked to be on this panel was, what do Japanese people, what do Asian people and Asian Americans even think about this piece? And so I found this transcript of a panel that Seattle Opera did. And they had, I think, 8 Asian American artists, Filipino, I think, Chinese, Japanese, and they all worked in the arts in some capacity. And they had a really, really good conversation. But something that really stuck out to me from that conversation was, and if you see me on my phone, well, first I had to share our live stream on social media. And then, but I've been trying to grab my notes. To grab, I took something down from that that really stood out. And one of the, Jenny Poo, who's an artist in Seattle, and she goes under the name The Shanghai Pearl, she said to her, Butterfly was a piece that was for white people by white people. And she said, who needs this story? And I thought that was a valid question. Why? Why are we doing this story? And so the conversation went into a lot of, why are we doing this? Why is it necessary? If this story is to be told, what story is it to tell? Okay, so, maybe a European composer wrote it, but it's not his story, it's about us. Do we get to tell the story? How do we tell the story? There was an Asian American director, a Japanese American director who had been asked to direct the show, and he said, I thought hard about it and going to do it, and they wanted some traditional things, and I just didn't feel comfortable with that, and I kind of had avoided my career. And he said, but eventually, I chose to do it, and he made some changes, and actually something similar. I don't know if you had a chance to read the blurb about in series production. If you have, you should. But he did some changes as well to the story. I think going back to the original story and looking at how do we present these characters. What are these stereotypes of, the submissive Asian, and how do we deal with this character of Kate and how she comes back, and he wrote something that he said people liked that I changed some things, but they hated the fact that Kate wasn't nice enough, she wasn't angelic enough, but I didn't think she should be presented that way because she was literally coming to take this person's baby. Like, that's not reality, and so he just talked about who should get to tell this story? How should we tell this story? Why are we telling this story? And one of the panelists said, if we're not going to reimagine it, if we're not going to do it differently, because if we just have to have this beautiful music, but we're not going to do anything different with this story, then why are we doing it? Is it worth doing it? And to me, so that's what, anytime I think about this show, for me, I immediately go to those issues. It's not even about the beauty of the music anymore, because I think if we are not willing to unpack those issues, everything else is tainted. Is it cultural appropriation or appreciation? How can it be appreciation if nobody's in the room from the culture that you say you're appreciating? Mm-hmm. If nobody from the culture has a voice and telling you, how can you appreciate a culture? Somebody on that panel said, can you appreciate a culture if you don't care if the things you do are traumatic for them? Can you really appreciate that culture? And I thought these are, and that panel was so great too. even just reading the transcript, because we do have these model minority and submissive stereotypes about Asian Americans. And no, those stereotypes might not be the stereotypes that get them shot down in the streets, but they are still problematic and they cause issues for so many reasons. And they also talked about, experiences living in Seattle, current, present day of being Japanese American and trying to speak to a stranger who, told them to go back where they came from, or their memories, their ideas of them being based on these images of Japanese Americans from World War II and all these things. And so to me, my experience with Butterfly at this point is, if you're doing it, what are you doing with it? I think when I was an undergrad, I had a fabulous teacher, Dr. Louise Toppin, and she used to always say, you can make whatever choice you want. You just need to be able to back it up. If you want to make that choice, that's fine, but you need to be able to tell me why. And I think for me, that's what it is with Butterfly. Fine, if you want to do it, do it. But there's plenty of beautiful music in the world. So you need to be able to give reason. What do you think this show says? Or what do you want to say with it that makes it purposeful or gives you any reason to be presenting it in this day and age? And I think if you're willing to kind of reimagine it, if you're willing to dig into the history of it, if you're willing to bring people in the room who have a different perspective, if you're willing to talk to Japanese Americans or Japanese people in general about how they feel about this work and what they would do with it, then we can move somewhere. But if we're at a point where we're just doing it for the sake of doing it because it's pretty, there's so much more that we can do. And so I think the real question is, who's telling the story and how are you telling the story and why are you telling the story?
All these things have sort of come up in what you said, so I'm just gonna throw out the other titles and hopefully we can discuss. And if they get Corby, I'd love to talk about Corby. I'd love to talk about Monostatos. And I'd love to talk about Othello. So if anyone has any thoughts on this larger conversation, but sort of through those guises.
It's interesting. I think that when you look at in the composer's mind, when they write these operas and these librettos, they probably don't have a thought in their minds like, I'm going to demean this people. They very often, it's often said, like imitation is like the best form of flattery. And you look to today's society, especially in the US, I mean, of course, we have lots of reasons, that for different groups to be contentious with one another. But like America, was a big experiment, right? People were saying, well, is this going to work? All these freedoms, people can come together. And of course, we've gone through and we still go through all of our xenophobia but if you take something like a fairy tale, people tell stories in order to escape the realities. If you're around a campfire and, you tell a story of some boogeyman or whatever story, like each teller of the story is going to embellish it. And, if you've ever tried to really get someone into a story as a storyteller, like you pour yourself into the characters, you mimic the voices, you mimic how scary the person's going to be or how sneaky they're going to be. Or you take the Goldilocks and the three bears, the bears eat you, like my dear, she probably, wolf didn't go right there, the teeth came at the end. But I don't think we have like the same intent with this artwork now as when it was created. Like, I'm certain that when you take something like Magic Flute or even Butterfly or like the composer wasn't thinking, now 100 years from now, they're going to do this here in this place and so forth. You know, they were creating like diversions for people who, for one reason or another, felt probably some degree of stuckness in their lives. So like the intent of the opera or of the artwork was probably very different than defending diversity or standing up for different people's rights. Equal rights for every culture and inclusion is a relatively, I won't say it's a new idea in concept, but in practice it's relatively new. And so, and yes, and not done yet, but we have here classical music, and this is a different conversation, classical music, contemporary popular music, and what is the artist doing? Because so many times, like in our field, you know, we go to the music school, to the conservatory, we practice the old, you know, I'm calling the Bach, Beethoven, what Italian art calls, whatever these are, the Bibles, we practice the canon, and we are looking for acceptance and approval. Really, it's like we, you know, when you graduate, you have a license that says you now have permission to survive. But like, what place is that for an artist? You know, to ask permission. So, and then you get someone who graduates and they audition for people who are going to give them permission to do the things that they've learned how to do. And you very often, I think, have an artist who is really someone who's well trained to sound like other people's ideas of art, as opposed to an artist who says, I have a message and I have to use beauty in some way, and I have to use whatever technique I use to get the message across has to be good enough to get that message across so that it arrives in such a way that my audience begins to add their own story to whatever it is they're experiencing. And I think that's what makes the art alive. So even though the notes, the butterfly don't change or magic flute doesn't change, what the audience member adds to the story does change, and that's why the art changes. And that's why the art will evolve, and our opinions about the art. So I imagine, you know, when you take butterfly, and you have the folks, you know, dressed up like putting on the makeup and trying to look like people that they aren't. No one's thinking, oh, I might offend an Asian, because where they grew up, they weren't, you know, having coffee with Asians and saying, oh, you know, how should I play somebody from your family? You know, they're playing make believe, you know, and so it's a really interesting conversation, because like we live in a culture right now that's, I dare to say, like hypersensitive in some ways. But at the same time, obviously we have legitimate reasons to be angry at injustices. We have, you know, this is not necessarily a political conversation, but I think we live in a world now where the curtains that made up the social veneer have been ripped apart. And people are angry, not because there's something new there. They're angry because they've been made to be aware. And so if you're going to be aware and you're going to continue to survive well, then you have to observe things, you have to make decisions, and you have to take action. And to the degree that you close your eyes, your ears, your senses, you're not going to observe. And if you're cut off from the fruits of observation, you're going to behave in stupid ways. You know, if you can't observe, you know, if you won't make decisions, then you have less responsibility. And if you won't take any action, then people who have ill intentions really can drive the society downward. So how do we, and I think it's important because we're marrying a training tradition which is conservative, which is traditional, to a public which is evolved in ways that allow them to speak their minds freely. We have to, I think it's very good, like this, we have a space for a conversation where we say, yeah, all right, we got this old music that we love and it's beautiful and it has its tradition and we get to hear the beautiful high notes and the melodies that we all love to hear, which, Puccini's melodies actually very much sound like soul music and spirituals to me, and there is something about, not to get technical, but at least this pentatonic type of folk sounding melodies that everybody resonates with. But I think that's part of the art and the technique is you give something familiar to your audience and then they can begin to add their story. So it becomes up to the director to then tweak a little something, or maybe have something in the program notes that asks a question, or to have a panel like this to ask a difficult question. Because obviously you're gonna have purists who say, don't change this, don't change that, don't change this. And you're trying to fill up seats in what people are saying is a dying art form. I don't think that our art form is dying. It's just that more stories need to be told. I don't think you have to go as far as have everybody naked on the stage to fill up an opera house. But people in trying to be different are doing things that of course, will seem insane to the purists or the people who a fairy tale doesn't go like that. The big bad wolf had clothes on when they told the story, So, we live in a world of sound bites,
Can I ask you and Colin to maybe talk about how that connects then to casting? Because I think opera has a particular type of obtuseness. And last summer, Robert Lepage tried to mount a production at the Montreal Jazz Festival of a piece called Salon. Why use the Eastern European spelling of slave, I don't know, to explore the American slave experience and slave songs. And of a cast of 12, I think 8 were white, including the actress playing Harriet Tubman. And this was canceled instantly. Who thought that was a good idea? And there's another really interesting discussion to have about that, because Robert Lepage's response was, well, theater is a place where we get to live other people's experience and that makes us better. And somehow that rings true, but it doesn't ring true now.
No, because you can't separate that from, I say all the time, you cannot separate anything that you do really, but in our art, from history, from context.
And right in contemporary time.
Right, exactly. And from culture. You can't do that. You simply can't. And it's like, and I thought about something when you were talking, we have to really talk about intention versus impact, right? Yeah. Your intentions can be so great and that's wonderful, but your impact matters so much more. And so even to what you were saying, your intentions may have been great. Maybe you love spirituals. Maybe you think more people should hear the music. Maybe you have all these ideas about, white people should sing this music and we want to make it, and there are so many ways you can go about making that happen, right? You can champion the works of Black composers. You can champion education and talk to choral conductors and teachers about, hey, you should be programming spirituals as more than your fun piece at the end of your concert. And we can talk about it being serious music. There's so many different things that you can do to whatever your end is, that make your impact as important as your intention. Because everything, it being a means to an end just can't be the thing. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, but you're right. And it's also about resources. I think I got a lovely email last week from a woman, and her and her husband have written an opera about a gospel choir that sang for Lincoln before the Emancipation Proclamation, and it sort of hypothesized on the influence this might have had on Lincoln. It's an older white couple from Berkeley, and it's a beautiful idea, but we're a very small company, I'll get to commission the new work every 4 to 8 years at best, and it's about resources. If I can't in right-mindedness give that platform to, and that feels painful, but it's just the way
But
it
it
is.
shouldn't though, right? Because like you said, you have, this, what I just did Jubilee over at Arena, which was a new work by Tazewell Thompson. And he deserves the applause. It was fabulous work. And what really stuck out about that work was the way that he centered, and he's a Black writer, obviously, he centered Black voices. And even the white characters were played by a Black actor, and the way he wrote it so that that could happen. And it was fabulous. And one thing that he did in telling, first of all, like you were saying earlier, now we're seeing Black people have a platform to tell stories. So like, it's great if you know of a gospel choir that's singing for Lincoln or something like that, but why would we present that piece when we have so many Black people telling Black stories, or Asian people who want to tell Asian stories, or whatever the case may be, and don't have the platform? And then we have companies like yours, you know, who are saying, hey, we're gonna take the resources we have, and we're gonna take the people we have, and we're gonna appeal to our donors, and we're gonna say, we wanna do these new, fresh things, but we need to make space for these voices, for women, for minorities, for, you know, people from different, what it may be sexuality, it may be gender, it may be all these kinds of things, but we have to make space for these voices. And I don't think you have to feel bad about that. Like, that shouldn't hurt. What should hurt is these people who have power and big budgets who are not making space for, you know, these reimaginings or for these different voices. That should hurt. They should be the ones saying, no, this hurts. I need to really give a platform for some different things, and then rethinking how they are doing things.
Well, along the lines of the Lepage thing, I mean, that was instantly cut, and yet in opera, we're still in a place where Othello is often played by a white man. And I wonder, I mean, because you're actually on the ground casting things like Othello and Butterfly, and how that goes into your thinking as a casting director. And also, I want to say, I mean, WNO does an amazing job of diversity in their programming. And I know that that's a big thing for Francesca, and I wonder if you can also speak about that.
Yeah, so Francesca is in charge of Washington National Opera and the Glimmer Glass Festival. And it's actually very interesting. Last year, Opera America did a survey of the ethnicities, of the makeup of the casts of all of the major American opera companies. And there were only 2 companies in the entire country that did not have like an abysmal, really, really embarrassing amount of diversity on stage. And it was Glimmer Glass and Washington. And that is really because of Francesca. And so I really give her, she's a very smart woman, and she is a very conscious woman. And I wonder how much she was kind of one of the first major female opera directors on the world stage. And she fought really hard, and she had to come up against extreme amounts of misogyny and extreme amounts of sexism throughout her entire career to get anywhere. And I mean, the stories that she's told me, the things about what she, you know, the things that she had to go through, she never backed down. She never took anything as an excuse. She just went forward. So I think that she has a perspective, though, that then informs her and sees herself as someone that needs to support other people that would not have been given the benefit of the doubt. And so I will say, we were not planning on doing Othello at all. That was not at all the plan. We had a different title in mind, for which we had already hired Russell Thomas. And then I remember one day I was reading Opera News or something, and it talked about how he was going to do a one-performance version of it I forget which company, but that he had added to his repertoire, which he hesitated doing for the exact reason that he did not want to only sing. He can't just sing Othello for the rest of his life. And if, you know, Russell has sung in every single major opera company. He's one of the rare, he has one of the rarest voice types, which is a big, heroic, dramatic tenor. So since Russell is someone that is American, and he is a Black man, it is someone that we felt was worth doing this production for. So if you don't have someone that is worth doing this production, it goes back to what Brittany said, why are you doing it? Like, why would you do this if you don't have a reason to do it? Don't just do it because you can do it, and then you try to retrofit it, and then in the process making, you sort of end up negating the whole
So
point
how
of the
would you,
piece.
how would you answer those who say Othello isn't about race? You can do Othello with the white man.
I mean, Othello is entirely about that. All you have to do is like read read the Shakespeare, right? Like read the Shakespeare. There's so much of the description, so much about the pieces, so much about the way that he is treated, so much about the way that he is.
So why is it an argument in opera? Why in opera do we have this? This is still a major thing that you can make Othello not about race, which you would never
Because
ever
people
do
don't
that.
wanna-
They don't want to go there.
They don't want, I don't know why. And like I said earlier, it's so funny that this art form has become what it is. And I think that speaks to classical music in general, right? About the way we perceive this art form and how conservative it has become. You know, because when you think about even performance practices, like you sit quietly, you come in, and that was always the hard part about even being a young performer. You have to come in and say, my name is, and I'm going to sing, and you have to pronounce it right, and you have to say, and you're wearing heels, and you're this and that. And then you read about performance practice, and it's like, yeah, people used to do parlors, and then people used to yell out during shows, and now, oh my God, if a baby cries or a piece of candy rattles, like people lose their minds, and it's like, what have we done? What has been done? I mean, I can't say we, I'm not even gonna include myself. I start singing opera in my 20s, you know, but what has been done to this art form to make it such a conservative thing? And also, I think your question speaks more to the human condition. Why is this music you love? And this isn't just opera, right? We don't have to this isn't just opera. We're seeing this in everything. We're seeing this in pop culture. We're seeing this in sports right now. We're seeing this in everything. Why is this thing that you kind of like a lot more important to you than the human condition? I see, and I'm very candid, like moving to this area and being presented with the Washington Redskins all the time. And you see people, you know, and then when I see like Black people, even, not that Black people have more of a responsibility than white people to stand against oppression, because they don't. And white people certainly have a much larger responsibility to use their platform and privilege. But when I see that, and I see people, I love the Redskins, and I'm like, but you know what that word means? Because, like, I know you love football. I mean, I grew up watching football. I love football, but you know, we hold on to these things that, you know, we kind of like, or we kind of love, that in the grand scheme of things are just not important. And like, yes, there's some beautiful music and opera that we would love to hold on to and keep, but how, you know, it just speaks to the human condition. Why is that more important to you than whatever cultural statement it makes? And I think I have to disagree about your point about us being hypersensitive. I don't think that we can be hypersensitive when you look at the state of this world. And being a person who is both Black and woman and dealing with those issues separately, and then how heightened they are when those two things come together, I can't be hypersensitive. Like every day I'm seeing people who look like me, whether it be Black or female or both, dying from different things that are just because they are Black or female or both, you know? And so so for me, what does my platform matter? And what does my art matter if I'm not speaking to and caring about the human condition? And I just saw that the Toni Morrison quote today, and I'm not gonna try to quote it offhand because I'll say it wrong, but basically she said, you know, when you have power, then it becomes when you become free, it becomes your responsibility to free other people. And I was thinking about, like, why don't people do that? And I thought, you know, sometimes we equate a bit of success or a platform with freedom, and those two things don't necessarily go together. I think you can have a platform, you can get a little bit of power, you can get a few resources, and still not be free. And this art form, for me as a Black person, I love seeing people like Morris Robinson who are using their platforms to really speak about serious issues. Because to me, it's like, what is the purpose of having this platform? We get to sing, y'all, and get paid for it. Like, that's what I do every day. I get to sing and people like pay me to sing. That's amazing. Like, people go to work every day at jobs they hate to survive, and I get to sing and get paid for it. It is absolutely my responsibility to speak to the issues of the world. It's absolutely my responsibility to care if Asian American people say, we don't like these stereotypes. If they say yellow face is not okay. If, you know, if women say, we need to rethink these rapey kind of scenes. And like, absolutely it's my responsibility to use my platform to do what I can. And as a person who, you know, privilege is intersectionality. That's a whole nother conversation about intersectionality, but I live in spaces where I don't have privilege, and I live in spaces where I do have privilege.
Mm-hmm.
As a Black person, as a female, I don't have privilege. Those things by themselves. As an American, as a person who's college educated, as a performer, I do have some privileges. It is absolutely my responsibility to care enough about people, not just people like me, but in general, to care enough about humanity to say, this is not okay, and my hobby, especially as an audience member, my hobby, this thing that I like, this thing that I kind of enjoy, should not be more important than the human condition. And when I have a platform to do something about that, absolutely, that's my responsibility.
My pastor said a couple of weeks ago, she quoted someone, I don't remember who, but the quote was, worship that is unconcerned with justice is obscene.
It's pointless.
And I think the same thing about art
Yeah.
and opera specifically.
Yeah.
Unconcerned with justice.
And look at, we're talking
Especially with how much money it costs.
two huge institutions, right? The church, and then this classical music, this idea of whatever it may be, these institutions that are storied and they have all this history and there's all this power and there's all this money. What is the point if we don't use it to make things better?
And I just wanted to discuss Butterfly for a bit. There are a few points I wanted to make. One, I see Butterfly, and let's take Butterfly versus the Mikado, for example, which are two representations of.
Sounds like a great wrestling.
Oh, right. of kind of it's different Asian cultures that are then represented two different ways. Puccini, it was really reacting to, until the 1860s, really, Japan actually forcibly had its doors closed. They did not want any influence. They wanted the Western world completely out of their lives. So they didn't want anyone there. So around the 1860s, it finally gets opened up to the world. So of course, people are just fascinated because it's something new, it's something novel, and they just want to consume, you know, we have this habit of wanting to consume everything that is new and interesting to us. So they consume and they consume. So Puccini was reacting to this desire for consumption of these, this subject, these sorts of stories. And he actually did want to get it right. I will give him a little bit of credit that he really did actually want to get it right. And then he had a very good friend who was Japanese and asked her to go back and find specific music that he could put in there that would be authentic. And he asked for specific cultural references to be really checked. He had her really, really involved in collaborating in the process. Of course, it's still a European tradition, a European man telling a story that is not necessarily his. However, I've always argued with Butterfly, and this goes back to why are you telling this story, which I think is so spot on. That should be the question everyone is always asking about every production they do, especially productions like Butterfly. But if you look at it actually, I've seen enough productions now of it, and I really see it as, Butterfly is a very sympathetic heroine. And she's being completely mistreated by this like terrible American imperialist. And so by really leaning into that part of the subject material, it's actually a universal story. It's a story that I do want to tell. I want to show how this man really, I don't think Butterfly is the stereotype of submission, because in fact, she talks about how she doesn't want to follow her family's tradition because she wants to do what she wants to do. And so she's actually kind of plays against that. And in the process, she still gets torn down by this man. And so I actually like you, if you really can lean into those parts of the subject, then you are actually, then you're telling, I think, a story that is really interesting. Versus, for example, I think the Mikado is full of stereotypes. And what story are we telling in the Mikado? Like really, what is the purpose of it? Yes, it's fun. Yes, it's wonderful. Yes, it's great. But what are we trying to say? What are we trying to? What do we want you as the audience to feel? And Mikado's one of those that I'm kind of like, if you discard it because it's actually really offensive, and there's not a lot of tellings, I think, that giving meaning that are sensitive and actually good.
That's really interesting.
Why would you do it? I mean, with Butterfly, maybe you can emphasize certain parts of it, and like what you've done with this, where you kind of strip away and you make it really about the central core emotions and the central core conflicts between the characters. Then you can tell it in a way that is compassionate, that helps your audience gain a perspective and helps them maybe care about the world in a better way. But something like The Mikado, for example, yes, it was sort of satirizing British culture, but at a really high cost. That is not, like, why would you put your audience through that, or why would you put your community through that, which I think can be really irresponsible, unless you're really doing it in a specific way that tells like a really interesting story, or maybe really takes a stab at the fact that it's an offensive piece.
Well, Mikado is interesting, I think, because at that time, no one knew Japan, as you point out.
Right.
So
they would have no idea, right?
So it would have been
idea.
instantly available that this was a criticism of British democracy.
Right.
And I saw a production last year in London, similar to what the series does, actually, with a piano and in a bar. But they set the whole thing in the British consulate in Japan, but it was a British consulate, so everyone was British. So like the text still made sense, but it made it apparent that it was a criticism of British hypocrisy, which is returned in force right now. And that did work. Again, this is a question of how you.
Who does it work for? For me, that conversation always has to come back to what are people from those communities, of that culture,
Right.
whoever is being represented say. And, for me, it was important, as I said earlier, to go and try to find out. Because I actually have never talked to a person who is Asian about what they think about Butterfly. Being Black and having had so many conversations about something like Corgi among Black people, I had some ideas about what I might hear, but I wasn't sure, because you always, even within the Black community, you get people have different ideas about different things. But as I was reading, particularly from that panel, like it was very clear to me that when it came to Butterfly, it was very much like we do it differently or we don't do it. What is the point? And the director I was speaking about earlier, his name is actually Matthew Ozawa.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing he said, he talked about how it's not enough to like just engage in ceremonial things to try, he said there was a company and they brought in people to show them how to do like a Japanese tea or something. And he was like, that's not, like, you don't know about, and people are like, oh, well, this is, I know how we should do this because this is how they hold a fan, or this. He's like, that's not what Japanese culture is. Like, you don't know about Japanese culture because you know about these very surface level, things. And so that conversation really dug much deeper into like, if we're gonna do this, like you said, here's the why. I love how you brought that up with WNO and with the production that Russell's doing, because it's just like, why are we doing this? And not being afraid to say, maybe we shouldn't.
Right.
Not being afraid to say, if we do, then how are we gonna go about it? And I think, just to be quite candid, I think a lot of times in opera, we're far more worried about offending white people than about offending the folk who are actually going to be affected by whatever we do in these productions.
And I would actually like to point out that there's a lot of people that they'll say like, oh wait, now that people realize they have to be a little bit woke in their casting, so like, oh well, what if we cast, well that person is Asian enough to play this role, and I'm sort of like okay, so we're casting in a way that or some people are proponents of casting in a way that it's like, oh well, as long as they are like Asian enough, but would a Japanese person necessarily be comfortable with a Korean person or a Chinese person representing them given the history between their countries? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Or are people just wanting to be cast a certain way, so then that they feel comfortable the fact that the butterfly that they're seeing is Asian. But it's like, oh, so they're generically Asian, so that's fine for you, versus maybe
And an
really
Asian
thinking
butterfly, how
sense.
does that fix the chorus?
Right, exactly.
And
How
lungs
does
and
that,
all
exactly. How does that fix anything? So I think it's beyond sometimes the specifics of like the exact ethnicity. It's more, again, about the kind of general, what are we saying here? What is the point of our production? Why are we doing this? What is the story we want to tell? What do we want the audience to gain from this?
So-
Right, because, I was gonna say, because there was a Filipino actor who said, while I was performing in Butterfly, my aunt said to me, well, it's gonna be difficult for your grandmother to see this. And he said, why? Well, during the war, Japanese soldiers actually killed her brothers.
Yeah.
And so there's history and there's context.
Everywhere.
And it doesn't mean that you can't do a thing, it just means that you need to consider what you're doing, and how you're doing it, and why you're doing it.
So, my predecessor, Carla Hubner, did an amazing job of making series a company that honors diversity and has higher diversity, just like, and I'm really proud that our casts are so diverse. And I'm really aware that when we did demographic surveys last year, 76% of our audience is white. So it's not casting's not enough. So I'm getting at the hard question.
I will
How do
say,
we change that?
I will say that yes, I'm very happy to work for a company that does celebrate diversity and has a diverse cast on stage. But I hesitate to say we shouldn't ever be celebrated or congratulated for it, because we really, it's like it's a no-brainer. This is how it should be. And I mean, I hate to talk in like absolutes and shoulds or whatever, but like, yeah, really, we're doing like what is kind of like we're doing like baseline of what everyone's behavior sort of, I feel needs to be in kind of this artistic sphere, because, and so if you're doing less, that's just not a good thing. So I'm glad, I feel very fulfilled. I don't know that I would thrive in an opera company that was not like this, but again, I hesitate I just want to point that I don't think that it's necessarily a celebration, because why are we the only ones? Like, why is In-Series one of the only ones? Like, why are we why are those companies so few and far between? Why are we even having to make a distinction? Why are other people not doing it?
I think that's where you're headed right now, right?
Well, I want to know how we change our audiences.
Well, I have a question, because isn't a lot of the decisions about like programming for a public have to do with money, right? I mean, we live in a time where entertainment is basically free. If you can get on the internet, you can be entertained. And I think people use art to lay down their burdens. They don't necessarily go, like if you go to a movie, you don't say, I'm coming here to be very, very educated right now. You don't do that. You've had your burdens, you have your stresses, you want to check out for a while. And if you're not a person that's going to, if you're not a drug user or you're not, heavily abusing other substances, then, it's a safe way to check out for a while. And so if you can, and you have to think of yourself as the artist. Aesthetics, art, it has to do with the spirit, for me, I believe. And you can heal a person temporarily for free. Not spend a dime. Sing the right phrase, and they relax, and you've made no currency that you can spend at the CVS down the street. But maybe in the spiritual realm, you said, okay, I've helped someone to be a little less hateful today. But you look at classical music. It's classical because it's tried and it's true. And people are willing to invest in successful actions that made them money before.
But do those things, I think there's such a misconception that doing things, and like you said, absolutes can get, although I do speak in absolutes at times, but I don't have any.
There's certain absolutes that are worth speaking.
But I get what you mean. I think there's such a misconception that being progressive, like it's almost like it's a dirty word, or being, for me, it's more like being thoughtful, being human, being caring, being what we should be. It doesn't mean like if I say I want to take out a scene that kind of normalizes rape, or if I say I don't want to put blackface or yellowface on a person, that doesn't mean that you have to come into a show and be thinking about Colin Kaepernick. Like, that's not what it is. It's not saying that social justice has to be at the forefront of my mind as I'm trying to get my entertainment. It is our artists and administrators coming together and saying, we can entertain without doing these problematic things. We can entertain people without having a white person painted up to look like they're black or they're Asian. We can entertain people without, having rape scenes that might trigger people. We can, and of course there are, then it comes back to like does that mean you can never have a show that has a rape scene or something? No, but what purpose does it serve? So I just want to clarify that. There's going to always be content that can be controversial or triggering or whatever, but what purpose does it serve? Are we normalizing it? One of the things that I'll go back to when we talk about doing Butterfly, and we talk about highlighting all the problems with it. How much good is that doing if we leave the theater and what we really remember is just that beautiful music, right? If we do it in this traditional way and we kind of console ourselves by saying, oh, but we know that it's speaking to these issues, and look at colonialism and look at this and da 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 da, but we see it so much that it becomes normalized. We see it so much that we're desensitized. It's kind of like seeing images of violence on television or whatever. So we can see Butterfly a million times and we kind of know that it speaks to like these issues, but we're desensitized to that and we just thought, oh, she sang it beautifully and that's that. And so we're talking about reimagining these kinds of shows with these huge issues. What people are saying is that there has to be something bigger than these issues. We have to tweak it, we have to rethink it, because otherwise, I don't care how many times you say it's about colonialism, people are not going to walk away with that message. They're just going to walk away with all these problematic things that we didn't touch and beautiful music. But there are opportunities for people to come and simply be entertained and without making it all heavy. Because I don't think Black artists or administrators and people, it doesn't mean, if you're casting, if you're writing grants, if you're an activist, it doesn't matter. I don't think there are any people who represent marginalized groups, that don't want to also be entertained. I think that's when people say representation matters. They're not saying representation matters so I can go, put up my fist and everything I do. They're saying representation matters because I'm funny and I just want to be able to be funny. Or representation matters because I have a great high C and I just want to go sing it without somebody saying, I'm going to cast that Black girl for that Black show. Representation matters because if, I think they were saying, I was reading about film and they were saying like Asians represent 16%, I think, of the population in, I think, New York, and like 2 or 3% in film and television of characters represented. And a lot of times even that is Asian characters, like specifically Asian characters, or Asian people advocating from whatever position they're in to get Asian people there. So, I think, so all that to say, I'm rambling, but to say that I don't think marginalized people, women, Black people, Asian people, whatever, want everything to be heavy. What we actually want is everything to not be heavy.
Right. Letting your burden down.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point in saying, for example, I think the biggest issue for opera in casting, if we're going to go back to casting, is the fact that why don't opera companies have a Black Lucia or an Asian Leonora? Why? I think in an ideal world, or in the world that I want to live in, you're not just hiring, the Black artists aren't just in Porgy. They're not just in, they're in every show. They're in, you have representation in everything. And it's not just like, oh, well, we're gonna do these heavy hitting shows just so we can show that we are being diverse and we're showing diverse voices. It's including everyone in all layers of all standard rap.
Yeah, there's still so many people who don't, I mean, it's 2018, and when people say, "Oh, what do you do?" "Oh, I sing classical music." I sing like opera. Oh, because they're still confused. Like black people sing opera.
Right, exactly.
Can I use that to pivot to opera America?
Yeah.
This is a cover. I'm for some reason uncomfortable. I don't know why.
I saw.
Good.
I didn't get to read it though, so I'm not gonna.
Well, so this is the cover of the latest Opera America, and the title is "Where Are Our Singers of Color?"
We're here.
Yeah.
But
And let me tell you something.
there is this perception that I hope you guys can expand on, that there was this day when there was Kathleen Battle, and there was Jesse Norman, and there was Leontine, and there was Grace Bumber, and there was this day where we thought we were headed in a direction. And I've heard people say, what happened?
It's no more. Look, if the article, and I want to be clear that I haven't read it, so if the article is saying that, if the article is saying, hey, we had Grace Bumbry, and we had Leontine, and we had all these wonderful people, and where are they? Then that's great. But the question that, and the misconception, or even outright lie that is put out more often is that we're not here, right?
So, but what happened then?
Well, we're not being cast.
So
So you can look at the Metropolitan Opera right now.
Yeah.
And you go to any of their social media pages and they're heavily promoting Porgy and Bess.
Right.
And they hire all those black opera singers to sing Porgy and Bess. And guess what? For all of them, there are a bunch of us who are not up there doing that show, right? Some of us will be doing Porgy in the spring with WNL. I'm doing more than just that. But this idea that, and I actually wrote a note, because I'm glad you said that. I actually wrote a note for myself to make sure that I got to this point. There is this lie that is often told about the pipeline, that there aren't enough singers of color, and specifically black singers, in the pipeline. Oh, we don't have enough black singers, so that's why they're not being cast. They're not here. It's just not true. And that's not to say that we don't need to address the pipeline, right? Not just for black singers, but for everybody, because we're talking about, when you start talking about that, that's another whole conversation about arts education and arts advocacy and how we don't have state-funded support for the arts like other countries and all of those things. So yes, obviously we need to deal with the pipeline, but this idea that black singers are not available, so that's why they're not being cast, but somehow you are able to find dozens of black singers every time you need to do Porgy, because they all show up to audition, and everybody, and so, and to the point that you have black singers. I had a friend who went in an audition, and there was a black singer who had a wonderful career in the audition. I'm not gonna say who, but my friend took Summertime from Porgy into her audition, and that opera singer looked at her and said, excuse my language, take that shit off the list. Why? Why did she say that? Because if you go out and you do it, it's been common knowledge among opera singers that you can become typecast. Mm-hmm. Go show them that you can sing the rest of the repertoire first and come back to Porgy. Morris Robinson just talked about that. He just did his first Porgy. And he just talked about that. I needed to go out first and show them that I could do all this other bass stuff. And then now I have the opportunity to come back to Porgy. And Porgy has its own problems, but it's certainly like a huge part of the repertoire. And it's something I think that most black singers want to do. They just don't want to be typecast in it. Yeah. So, when you say, where are our black singers? That question is not for you to be just throwing out there asking like, where are they? And it's certainly not a question for us. That question is for white administrators. Where are your black singers? Because those black singers are being educated. Those black singers are coming through the pipeline to say that, we're like, it's not a question of us not being available. Now we can talk about the barriers in this art form. And I think there was a social media thread just about this recently that I saw that you commented on from a young singer who said, it is so hard to try to make it in this art form, to try to survive every day and work and pay my bills, but also come up with money for application fees. Mm-hmm. That to do an application that doesn't guarantee that I get an audition, and to travel to do these things. And so that may be a worthwhile conversation when we talk about singers of color, who of course we know generally black people don't necessarily have the same amount of income as their white counterparts, or may not have the same exposure to certain things, the same networks. Those questions, yes, like those are worthy conversations about what are the barriers for singers of color. Those are worthy conversations, but those barriers are not the reason that we're not seeing more Black singers on the stage. That's not the reason, because to have, I mean, after what, maybe Jesse Norman and Kathleen Battle, or there was Denise Graves. I don't think we've had a Black star since Denise Graves, not a female, and Larry Brownlee may be probably the only male that I can think of. And it's not because there aren't Black singers available.
Right, and there is a new generation, but they are being cast in, oh, you're the Black singer, so here's a Black opera.
And for all of those that you see, like, I mean, we see, and we're seeing it across the world, right? Like we're seeing Pretty in Day, and we're seeing Larry, and we're seeing Russell, and we're seeing Black singers, but there are so many more. I can go down my Facebook list right now and give you a list of 100 Black singers with no, and these people can sing. Because, and this is one thing that I say, you know, when I'm at Peabody, like, we've had to have these conversations about, for Black people to even get into a lot of these spaces, we have to be exceptional. That idea of you gotta be 10 times better, you know, then that's a real thing. That's not something that people make up in their minds. And so when I was talking about diversity in the faculty at Peabody, and we fought so hard trying to get more diversity in the faculty, and I said, do you not realize that you have this very white faculty, and then you bring in Denise Graves, you bring in Eric Owens, you bring in Anthony McGill, who was a clarinetist, I think, and he was with, like, played for the Met, and, like, you know, you bring in these, like, amazingly exceptional Black artists, and that's great, like, that's wonderful. But you got all these white people on your faculty that nobody knows. Regular people, talented people, intelligent people, people that I, during my time, enjoy working with, but not people that have to be superstars to get a chance. And so that's when we see the same thing when we're talking about artists. Black singers should not have to be Denise Graves or Morris Robinson and have these, or Solomon Howard, you know, these people who have these voices that are not just good, but are, like, so unique in these crazy ways. They shouldn't have to be that to get an opportunity. And so it's not that we're not here, and it's not that we're not capable or talented or hardworking, because, like I said, you're not getting into Peabody as a Black singer if you can't sing. You're just not. You're not, you know? You're just not. And there are a million things I can say and go on forever, but a lot of these spaces where Black singers, you're seeing them being in these conservatories or in these great schools or even getting to opera courses and like, we have to be pretty good to even get looked at in these spaces. So this idea that, you know, Black singers are not here or capable, no. And I think in my reading, preparing for this and just kind of really wanting to get, like, an Asian perspective on these things. Some of the same things about, like, being typecast, about, you know, well, I went ahead and did Butterfly so that I could get to know people. And once they saw that I was capable of doing other things, then they cast me. But why should people have to go through that? You know, why should I have to do Porgy and then, you know, go above and beyond trying to make relationships with every administrator and director and this person and that person to show them, oh, you know, I can do these other things too. Great, but why should people have to go through that? So the question, if we're asking where the singers of color, who are we asking?
Yeah, it's a question of direction.
Right, who are you asking? And I agree, I feel like Brittany really has hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think such a main issue, and I think this is so telling, maybe it seems, but if you've got, let's say you take all the spread of, like, the middle talent, not like the most amazing voice, not like the most terrible, the person that's going to get the benefit of the doubt is the white singer. And I've seen it, I mean, I have to say, I've seen it time and time again. And it's not just even, I'm not even going with the white singer. It's the white singer that fits into exactly what the administrators want and who they want them to be. I mean, I will say, okay, look, I have very colorful shoes. I have four earrings. I do not fit there are certain things about me that don't fit into, I think, what many people in my position at other companies would be. I cannot tell you how many times I have been passed up for things I was almost not hired in my current job. I was said that I was almost passed up because I was considered too gay for it. And that was from a gay man. So it's like, I can't get hired by a gay man because I'm too gay, even though technically, if we're talking about like the the spectrum of being gay, he actually is a lot less heteronormative than I am, yet I'm discriminating against people. So it's not just, I think that unfortunately in opera, there is this tradition. And we've got these traditions of you have to be this certain way, and you've got to be passable to this certain kind of donor, you've got to be passable to this certain thing, and you've got to be, and they have to approve of you, and you have to go through all these many layers of approval, and you have to strip down any part that's outside of your personality in order to be taken seriously. I mean, that's like the baseline of where we are. So even among every person, you have to fit a certain thing. So then you factor in people's prejudices. I would like to point out that there are no directors of artistic planning in a major opera company of color. There just isn't.
And if you don't have people of color in the room, already that battle is lost.
Absolutely.
It's absolutely lost. It doesn't matter what intentions are, it doesn't matter how progressive people think they are. You know, it's just like sometimes you see like national like companies and stuff, and they'll do something like absolutely ridiculous, like just stupid. And black people will look at each other like, so they ain't have one black person in the room. Not one. Or even with women, like you'll be like, oh, so you just had no women anywhere, because one woman in the room would have told you this was not going to go well. It's like, it's that kind of thing where it's just like, but if you even had one person in the room, like one marginalized person, one, you know, not that I can't speak for Asian people and I can't speak for, you know, Latinx people and whatever, but even just having somebody who have, you know, these similar experiences where I read something one time, this whole article, I think it might have been in the Post, I can't remember, and it said, everybody talks about race except white people. And white people are the only people who are surprised that everybody talks about race. And I'll tell you this, even when I accepted this, I didn't know who else was on the panel, and I saw later and I was like, oh, Colin's on the panel. Oh. You know, because I work for them, you know, and I thought, oh, what does that mean? I still have to do that. And if you know, and I'm pretty out of my peers, I would say I'm, you know, pretty vocal about a lot of things, but even I had to say, well, what will this conversation be? And what does it mean? How will this conversation go? And what does that mean? If I have a thought, am I going to censor myself for the sake of maybe being afraid of like, we have to ask these questions every day. But if you put black people in the room, or you put Asian people in the room, or you put women in the room, or you put, in opera, we don't have to worry about gay people because they are always in the room.
But you have to be a certain kind of gay person.
Yes.
That's the problem. That's the thing, right?
Respectability is,
right.
That is a thing with every marginalized group. You got to be a respectable gay person or a black person or whatever. You have to fit into these norms still, not too gay, not too black, not too this or not too that. And always trying to censor yourself and always being afraid about if I say this thing or if the Porgy and Bess thing recently in Florida, there was this production of Porgy and Bess. All these people, and it's funny because I just last week had a conversation with someone that was in that production, and it was actually far worse than what I thought, like what had been made public. But all these people go down, they do this show, and as an artist, when you leave home, your bills don't stop. Like, my landlord is not gonna say, oh, I know you got that show in Florida next week, so don't worry about your rent for that month. And you still gotta pay, you just gotta take care of your expenses. And all these people go to Florida to do this show and they don't get paid. And of course, people are afraid to rock the boat. You don't wanna be the one. If you are the one, you're like, well, if I speak out, are people gonna back me up? Are people gonna be silent? Is everybody gonna be scared? And eventually Morris Robinson went to the show, found out what was happening and got on social media and made it a thing. And then it kind of went viral and it became a thing, and all of a sudden we're seeing people get checks. But so many singers who are in marginalized groups don't have the platform that he has, right? He's booked all year, and he has a level of security and has established himself enough that he can use his platform to do things like that. But I know a number of people who are in that production and at different levels in their career, and nobody has spoken publicly about what was happening. So you got all these people who have sacrificed to go and do this thing and don't have the money. Now, everybody's at different levels in their career, and everybody's life outside of music is different. So some people might have full-time jobs, some people might gig full-time, some people have side hustles, whatever it might be. And to see a group of Black singers be treated that way, and feel like they had no recourse to do anything about it, like, we got problems. We got big problems. And even in doing something like this, you always have to think about, if I say these things, am I still hireable? Are people gonna label me as a troublemaker? Are people gonna back me up? Are other Black people or gay people or women gonna back me up? Will they be afraid? And so as long as we have to continue to have not only these conversations, but have people from marginalized groups that are afraid to have these conversations or are tired of having these conversations because nothing changes. Look at the audience now. Like, I would have loved to see more people of color come to a panel like this. And I know that being a weeknight and all that contributes to that, but it's also, I think a lot of times people are like,
Sure.
What's the point?
I have a question. So is it enough to put people on stage from
No.
different groups? Because if you're still telling old stories, you know, it seems like a production like Butterfly is really only like a starting point to have a conversation. Because you don't actually address the issues that people need to address, because now we're in a place where people are free to speak out and say, I'm hurting you this way, or how dare you portray this, you know, and I think it's wonderful that people can speak out now, but I also think at the same time, like, where are the composers who are going to tell the stories? Who's going to take the risk with the creator from the marginalized group to put that story up? Because, all right, sing Mozart, sing Puccini, sing Wagner even, you know, and then you can, any of these things that you can anger someone on stage. So putting the story up and casting whomever you cast, right? It's like throwing, you know, a drop of water on a big blaze, you know, it's if you don't continue the conversation and the outreach beyond the show, what are you really doing with the art?
And also internally on all levels.
All levels.
Yeah.
But audience is
On the board.
important too, right? The audience, you asked that earlier, what are we gonna do about our audiences? I'll tell you this misconception that Black people don't like classical music. I grew up in the South, I grew up in North Carolina, and I grew up singing gospel my whole life in church. And when I moved here to go to Morgan, all of a sudden, all the Black churches, every denomination, I sing in Adventist churches, I sing in Baptist churches, I sing in Methodist, every denomination is like, yeah, come sing. No, like, come sing your, and I'm like, I can sing my classical? What are you talking? Church? You don't pay me like this. Do that. And all Black churches do classical music, and you might get a program where on the same program you have like Beethoven and like Kirk Franklin on the same program, and you think nothing of it, and they do it all well. And there's this misconception like that Black people don't like classical music. No, Black people like classical music, but what does your outreach look like? What do your circles look like? If you're building an audience, how do you build an audience? What does your network look like? If your network is all white, or if it's all older, then how do you reach those people from different demographics? Just like any other company has to figure out how to market to different demographics. I love when I see videos all the time of Black people singing classical music go viral on social media. And Black people go nuts. And in our culture, particularly celebrating young people who are doing amazing things, it's like a really big deal. So even now, like as an adult and as I get older, whenever I'm in Black spaces, Black people are wildly supportive of anything that you're doing. And so when Black people find out, oh, you sing classical music, or you do this thing, or you or you went to school for this or whatever, they're so wildly supportive and so happy and so willing to support with their time and their money and their whatever. When I did Jubilee, it was so crazy. It's such a different thing to see. Though Jubilee was called a play, and it played with music, but we joked the whole time that it was an opera because we sang for like 2 hours. And acapella for 2 hours. And so we always joke like, whatever, they call it whatever they want, this is an opera. And those seats were packed out. When Fisk University came, they bought out the house, and all the alumni came and they were there and they were so supportive. And when we had our dinners and our, all different things, and you had all these Black people that were in these spaces, and it was like, Black people enjoy all different types of things, these misconceptions about what people like. And I'm sure that if there was, a Hispanic person up here or an Asian person up here, they would be saying the same thing, that our communities like different things. We're not, monolithic. There are so many things that people enjoy and would support if they felt like they were welcome in those spaces. It's not enough to say that spaces are open. Are they welcoming? Mm-hmm. And welcoming is a very different thing, right? Because I went to 2 predominantly white institutions for my education, as well as a historically Black college, and they were very different experiences, right? I went to Peabody Conservatory, and when I started the Society of Black Alumni for Peabody, there was already one at Hopkins, but not one specifically for Peabody. And we started having these things called cupcakes and conversations, where people would just come back. We would order these like gourmet cupcakes, and we would have drinks and things, and we would just sit and we would talk. And I tell you, like, those things were great. They were also sometimes very heavy, because a lot of times it would be tears. And I had someone come back who had not been to Peabody's campus in 10 years. I had alumni from the 60s and 70s saying, nobody's cared about what I've done since I graduated. So when we talk about pipeline, we talk about audiences, we talk about all these things, to get into a conservatory is not enough. Do you feel welcome in these spaces? If y'all knew how many meetings we've had where people were in tears because of the lack of support, or there were people, I had friends who left Peabody like, I hate Baltimore. And I was like, I love Baltimore, like, what do you mean? But my experience was different because I had already been in Baltimore and I was more connected with the city. But their experience at Peabody tainted them so. And it's not just Peabody, I'm not singling out Peabody, because in some ways they are more progressive than other schools, which goes back to what you said, when we like to say, oh, we meet the status quo, or we are a little bit better than the status quo, should not be the goal. Mm-hmm. But had such bad experiences that they hated the city. It represented such a negative time in their lives. Like, these are the struggles that singers of color are having in this field. Those are the real conversations. Those are the things that when you have to look at people and say, if you are serious about progress, and if you are serious about not just equality, but about equity, because equity is a different conversation when you're talking about making sure that people have the resources that they need to be able to compete in any given situation. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about equity. Because equality says, oh yeah, we all get the same thing, we all have the same chance. But equity recognizes that even if we're all put in the same situation, that doesn't mean we all have the same chance. And so when we're talking about those things and the experiences that people of color are having in this field and in this art form, it goes so far beyond, oh, I saw a Black singer on stage. What are these experiences like when these folks are coming up through conservatories? What are these experiences like if you don't have the resources to do things and you don't have a benefactor? What are these experiences like when you are allowed into the room but not welcome into the room? When you don't have the social capital, when you don't have the networks? Because one of the things that I talk so much about with the dean at Peabody is that you bring these people through here, you know, even those of us who come on scholarships are still going to end up with some debt. And Peabody is an expensive school, and so many of these other schools are as well. And if people leave here and they don't have connections and they don't have networks, it's been a waste of time. Because you can go anywhere and get voice lessons. You can go anywhere and find an ensemble to participate in. But if you don't get those experiences and those networks, because when I leave, if I graduate and I'm friends with somebody who's an administrator somewhere, that's a whole different thing than if I leave feeling isolated and not having made those connections. Those are the conversations about when we're talking about building audiences. Well, if you have Black people on stage, first of all, I mean, let's just be honest. If you have Black people on stage, you're gonna have more Black people in your audiences.
That's right.
When we have done productions where the casting is particularly diverse. You see it not. It's a very obvious thing. When you do something that shows a community that they are welcome. I don't care which community, what community it is. When you show community that they are welcome, they will be very happy to come. If you're not, it's like there's so many companies that don't do that, and then wonder why they don't have people come. And they're so bewildered, but then they're not willing to actually change.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. These conversations make people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But at what point do you just get comfortable with being uncomfortable? Right? And you say, fine, we have to be uncomfortable. If we are seriously, all of it always comes back to people for me. It just always comes back to people. And it's not a matter of being overly sensitive, or it's so easy to sit in a position of privilege and to say people are being so sensitive, right? Well, I've been seeing this in the last week or so with this Dave Chappelle thing, where I've been seeing a lot of heterosexual Black people even say, oh, people are just being overly sensitive. Well, that's because when we're talking about these issues with the LGBTQ community, if you are a cisgender person or if you are a straight person, now all of a sudden you're sitting in a position of privilege. So you think people are being sensitive because it doesn't affect you. So that's the same thing that we're saying to white people, is that this thing may not affect you, but just because it doesn't affect you doesn't mean people are being overly sensitive. You will never be able to empathize, because as a white person, you just are never going to deal. I don't care what other marginalized group you belong to. Race is so polarizing in our world. As a white person, there are just certain things you're just never, ever, ever going to deal with. Even if you have Black or brown children, even if you have Black or brown spouse, you're never going to experience it in that way. And you're not going to be raised up in a world where those things are heavy on you from the time that you are a child. You have this understanding from the time that you are a child that you navigate this world differently. Those are uncomfortable conversations for people. But what is the point of us convening in this way if we're not going to be honest about having them? And it's important for white people to have these conversations because you don't risk anything in doing so. Me, I risk everything in doing so. When I walk into a room and have these conversations, I risk my career in doing so in a way that Colin doesn't.
Right.
Right? So that's why it's your responsibility to have these conversations. It's not enough to say, oh, I don't talk to my own racist uncle who doesn't. No, you need to. You need to. You have to challenge these things in opera and in the arts and whatever. It is your responsibility to challenge these things and to challenge these people. It is easy to, put on, just say, nope, not going to deal with that, and remove those things out of your sight. And stay with those like-minded people. Because I always feel like in these situations, we end up kind of, in a way, preaching to the choir, right? Like even the white people that show up to a conversation about race are at least going to be somewhat open to having a conversation about race. Doesn't mean they're gonna agree with everything. Doesn't mean nothing's gonna make you uncomfortable or angry, but you showed up to have a conversation about race. But you have family members and church members and friends who would not come to something like this. So then whose responsibility is it to reach those people?
And I'm not friends.
They are your people. But they are your people, and you have a responsibility. You're privileged. You have a responsibility to do that, because there are certain spaces that I cannot walk into and have these conversations, right?
Or you won't have a receptive audience,
No.
right? Like people won't even they'll look at you, and the moment that they look at you, they'll just think like, oh, I'm not gonna trust anything that she says, or I'm not gonna listen to anything she says. You've got an automatic right block
All
against
these
you.
millennials, they just want everything. These social justice warriors, and they just, it's like that. So it is important that it's not, it's important, it may seem like it contradicts, but yes, it is absolutely imperative that people of color are at the table. It is absolutely important. But there are some deeper conversations that y'all gotta have when we're not in the room.
So usually we open up the floor for questions, and I knowingly stole that time. I hope you'll forgive me to allow the panel to speak. And maybe I guess we kind of have to stay with the reception and to greet you. Do you guys have any I hate to say final thoughts because it's like the very beginning.
How do you
any punctuation, Paul's marks for the moment?
I would like to, there's something, it's just a random thought that came to me that I just wanted to bring out, and it's that Tazewell Thompson, who I think we all adore, he wrote this opera called Blue that we're going to do. And people say, it's funny, you said that your first mention was like, oh, it's about police brutality, but he would actually not
I
want you to say
thought about that when I said it
He
too. I
wouldn't
thought
say-
about that.
Because really for him, he said, he has lived his whole life in Harlem. And he has said, I have never, ever seen an opera, I've never seen pieces of theater that represent me. He's like, I've never seen a loving family, just a loving, normal family with their kid raising their child represented on stage, especially an opera stage. There is no operatic story about that. And he said, I wanted to write that story so I could represent my existence in a way that isn't. And so and I took that point very much to heart. Like when there are so many operas that are about, I think, what is a stereotypical Black existence, people like to think of it, versus the reality of the living and working and everyday person that is not the, kind of white cisgender norm. So when we are thinking about conceiving of new works, exactly like you were saying before, we really have to be thinking of expressing just who we are and expressing the stories and representing just the regular voices, and not, I guess, like sort of tokenizing by who we're using to tell a story and choosing to tell certain stories.
I think that obviously elucidated lots of different issues like in this conversation, and obviously we can't solve everything at once, right? So like the smart thing to do would perhaps to maybe have some sort of survey or something that finds out like what the most salient points that people are interested in, and create art around addressing something along that line. And I think any movement when it comes to change is going to be successful to the degree that it can command attention. And if you can't command attention, you can't hold an audience. And if you can't hold an audience, then no one listens. And so you become an only one or a lone warrior, screaming into a tornado or hurricane. And if you can't get people to get one thing right, you find out what they're interested in, and then you address your art to that point, and you have attention, then you can solve something else, But without the survey, without the picking one thing first, then it's like you just scream in the face of, I hate the analogy, but like devastation, to an art form where people's needs don't get addressed. And it requires courage. Like I believe you are very, very courageous, because like I, as a pianist, as a conductor, as a coach, as a teacher, as an educator, I don't face the same sort of discrimination that you would being right there on stage. As a collaborative person, I'm always in an assisting position, a supporting position. I spend my time and energy getting people to be more certain about what it is that they're doing and debugging what's in their way so that they can feel brave enough to try. But it's like, we need to support people like that.
Yep, and we need more Black support people like that.
Because it makes a difference, and like I work at an HBCU and I see so much talent. People that can sing any style and voices from heaven itself. And they're looking for opportunities, but at the same time, they're also seeing what I see as a career path does not match who I am. And so it takes really wise planning, organizing, getting a team of people focusing on one thing first and promoting it so that people listen and they can see it. You know, right now, I one of the people I love, Pablo Tunde, with his hip hop run, but it's like, wow, this is cool, and he's reaching a large audience because he's found a common point, maybe he got lucky, maybe he did a survey and said, you know what, it looks like people like hip hop, and he's like, boom, with a beat there and here, Figaro, and it's like, but it took someone brave, because if he were still a conservatory student, asking for permission to survive, did I do it right? Will you please bless me, opera gods? He would never do that. And as much as one conservatory student, singer, pianist, violinist does that, an opera company does the same thing. They have probably the big donors, and then they have like the smaller donors, and they're like, if we take this bold, brave step, will we upset the gods to grant us licenses to live? And it requires being brave. So don't ask for permission to live, I believe we're all spiritual beings. The hardest thing to kill is a spirit, but you can kill an attitude. You can kill an ability or a willingness to try. But if you keep using your art to unstick people, and you're worse in it. And I know this because I worked in churches almost all my life. And churches sometimes have mean people in them. And if you can play in such a way or sing in such a way that it communicates some reality that says, oh, your art makes my life real, I can lay my hatred aside for a second. And now I'm willing to listen to you, because now you get to talk to the being. It's like seizing the opportunity to get a communication in. But so often we're afraid, and so we say, how are you doing? Oh, fine, thank you. So chauvinistic. Makes it seem all very mild. And so, and if we're always fine, we can't fix anything. So we need these brave conversations.
Recently, there has been a lot of conversation about a singer, a white singer, refusing to wear dark makeup to perform in Aida. And these conversations really took off, especially with social media. That's another conversation we can have about how we making use of social media in the way that we should, as individuals, as organizations, nonprofits, companies, whatever. But that's another, like with Baba Tunde, making use of social media. But the conversations took off on social media, and one thing I noticed is publicly, because there were private conversations, but publicly, most of those conversations were white people. And a part of that was that a lot of Black artists, I think, fear having those conversations publicly, right? I don't see a need to have a conversation about whether a white singer should darken their skin to a point that it looks like blackface, because to me it's an obvious no. And my question would be, why can't you just hire a Black singer? If you feel like the role needs to be Black, if we all agree that it needs to be some minority or whatever, why can't you just, we're here, we can sing. But I think one thing that stuck out to me was that there were some prominent Black voices saying, no, we do need to continue darkening skin. Because if we don't continue darkening skin for this role, then, and we go into this full colorblind casting, then what will be the incentive to hire Black singers at all? And how sad is that? And I wholeheartedly, fully hate and disagree with that perspective, but also fully understand it. And find it to be quite sad that, because I know that it comes from a place of fear. It comes from a place of we have a little bit and we're just trying to hold on to what we have. I've never been one to be comfortable with what I think are crumbs. And I'm not gonna beg for those and compromise integrity for those. So I get it, understand, and I think there were also some generational differences because, you know, younger singers and millennials are always like, no, we're gonna bug tradition. I don't think that's just millennials, I think that's just how young people are in every generation, right? It's no different from boomers in their generation or whatever. But I thought it was so sad that, because at the root of it, we can be angry, and as Black singers, we can butt heads and go back and forth about who's right and who's wrong, and you just don't understand how the industry works, and y'all are just old and scared, and you don't get it, and you don't want to change, and you just, you know, afraid and whatever, and we can go back and forth, and we can butt heads and all of that, but what it really comes down to is that people are so afraid of losing the little that they have, right, that they're willing to make these big, huge compromises in order to just try to keep it. And I have empathy for that. Even though I don't agree with that position, I have empathy, because what's really being said is, if they don't darken white people's skin, they don't have to hire Black singers at all. My responsibility would be, they obviously are not worried about hiring Black singers if they're already darkening white people's skin. So I don't think we have to continue a very offensive practice to keep Black singers being hired when the practice is happening because the Black singers aren't being hired, right? But I say that to say, these conversations are so important. I've seen the same thing about Yellowface dealing with butterflies specifically, where Asian singers that I've seen, I don't know every Asian person, obviously, and every Asian person is not gonna have the same opinion. But what I have seen has just been unequivocally, it's a no to Yellowface. It's a no. Hire us to sing it, consult us for your productions, or don't do it. But this whole painting white people to look Asian is nuts. Painting white people to look Black is offensive. We can't separate it, again, from history and context. You can say, no, it's not blackface, it's not the same thing. But we know our history and context are everything to us, right? It informs everything. Nothing exists without history and context. Like nothing is what we know it to be without history and context. Nothing even makes sense without those things. So we can't try to remove them when it suits us, or remove them when we want to do a thing that we shouldn't do. And so all that just to say that these issues are still so present and so relevant and so big that we could never conquer them all in even a series of conversations. But it's so important to have these conversations and then to figure out how we move these things to action.